well. But I don't think that's relevant to kind of this point that we're talking about right now.
I mean, it includes government spending and net imports and investment as well as consumer spending, right? So you expect UBI maybe to become like closer to 100% of consumer spending, but maybe not 100% of GDP because that's also got government spending in there. And I guess when you wouldn't be including UBI in that in GDP in that sense. Like you would still have the government buying various things that it wants to do.
Yeah, yeah. And then the question is, in your model, are you thinking about a closed economy, or are you thinking about kind of one nation among many that has this kind of like domestic, part that you can kind of carve out? So GDP is kind of a measure of goods and services produced within a country, in a year or something like that. But then the question is, okay, what if you produce them and sell them all as exports or something like that? And then there's kind of like there's different measures like gross domestic income, which measures total income by individuals and businesses within a country, that kind of thing, or there's gross national income, and there's a few different ways to slice it. What we really care about, if you're talking about a domestic basic income, what you care about is the absorption. So that's not how much stuff your economy is producing, that's how much stuff your economy is buying, right? Because the UBI is going to go to what you buy. It's going to be spent toward buying stuff, and that includes imports, right? So if there's a ton of countries trying to push products on you or something like that, that's capacity for you to have higher UBI, that kind of thing. So there's lots of kind of like details that you can get into with like what these different measures are and what they mean and how to even calculate them and that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of valid criticism for, like why maybe we shouldn't be targeting GDP as something or, like that kind of thing. But it's kind of like a general rough idea. It's like you're thinking like, well, what can the economy make for the people? Maybe modulo the investment that, you're investing in capital to produce stuff in the future or something like that. So some stuff is produced for consumers and some stuff is produced for capital formation.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like basically when Steve Keen makes the argument that, okay, it's going to be like 30% of GDP or whatever it was, then that's basically the argument that it's too expensive, right? I think rebuttal to it is basically the same as always. On the one hand, there's going to be less wages, right, because we're tightening interest rates, and so it's just going to sort of like replace that source of consumer income to some extent. And on the other hand, it can grow the economy as well, because the economy wouldn't be bottlenecked by consumer spending power, right? We can make more stuff if people do have more money to buy it.
Yeah. And we're also, like he is really kind of imagining, okay, a subsistence UBI, and we're not kind of saying that it has to be that. We're saying, you find out.
I think that's all that we could afford. Right? We couldn't afford any more than a subsistence UBI. I think he was saying, more or less.
I think he was saying that we couldn't afford a subsistence UBI, that we could afford a subsistence guaranteed income. Yeah. Is what he was saying.
Yeah. That was right.
And I think that's a lot of people's intuitions. I think people that often complain about or are worried about rising public debt. Have you seen anyone do that with private sector debt? Like specifically in the same way, like comparing private sector debt to total GDP. Do you know what I mean? And like, are people worried that that's too big or something like that, or it's unsustainable?
Yeah, I've seen Steve Keen do it.
Yeah.
He talks about the unstable growth of private sector debt. That's one of his things. I don't know if he's imagining that. It seemed to be like he was saying that the government doesn't borrow, like kind of an MMT-esque thing, but he does admit that they issue treasury securities and those are liabilities, and he admits that there's a debt and a deficit. So I don't know what he was trying to get at there. I think he was saying that money issuance wasn't really borrowing or something like that. Yeah.
I mean, it shouldn't necessarily make him against us if he wants to frame it as negative equity instead of debt or money printing as others do, right? Does he think that government spending is fundamentally like more dangerous than private sector debt? It sounds like no, right? He thinks that private sector debt is more dangerous. So replacing that with government money issuance, however you want to frame it, that should be a good thing, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of even more in line with Jeff Crocker type stuff. When I emailed them afterwards, I said, you could have Jeff Crocker on. I think he'd has a similar perspective to me, not exactly the same. We disagree on key points, but he's maybe even more aligned with Steve Keen on the kind of debt-free money issuance thing.
Yeah, I think they should talk to him. I think that'd be interesting. I guess it just
The main-
surprised. Yeah, that comment did that Keen's comment about, oh well, it obviously can't work because it would be X amount % of GDP. Like that did surprise me because my and perhaps uninformed impression of Keen's positions was that like he wouldn't say that about other ways of expanding the government debt. I thought he generally was sort of like we were just suggesting. He was worried really primarily about too much private sector debt and wanted to rebalance that with more public sector debt. So that would mean that the public sector debt to GDP ratio be going up for something else, just not in favor of UBI. You know,
I think he was less emphasizing that about the size of the debt relative to GDP. He was emphasizing the size of the spending relative to GDP. Like you're spending this percentage of GDP into the economy, he thought was not doable.
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay. So it's specifically the objection was to the amount of UBI versus GDP. Okay.
Yeah, and as far as the negative equity thing goes, I think thinking in terms of equity and net worth is kind of problematic, right? If we're taking kind of a money view perspective, we've got this time pattern of cash flows coming in, a time pattern of cash commitments going out, and whether they all add up to a positive number or a negative number is not super important. And I think it's not important for the government, and it's not really important for anyone else. What matters is that you can kind of pay your commitments, your payment commitments, your cash commitments as they come due, to the extent that you don't pay them, or you roll them over, right? To the extent that you're not paying down your debt, you're rolling it over, and that's not necessarily something that's bad. I gave kind of maybe not a great example when I was talking about ordinary consumers borrowing to buy a house, because they're not exactly negative equity because they have that house as an asset. But there are other things you can buy that like depreciate very quickly. Like if you buy a car and you borrow to pay for that, right? You finance that. That brings you into negative equity because the amount of you owe on your loan doesn't depreciate as fast as the value of your car depreciates. So that immediately brings you into negative equity. Is it a problem? No. Well, no. People do it all the time. It's a problem if you can't actually make a payment when it comes due. That's when you run into a problem. So that's a liquidity problem, not a solvency problem. It's not a problem of net worth. It's not a problem of equity being positive or negative. And when the government prints money, when they issue money or when they spend money, that doesn't make their equity negative on their own. To calculate that, you have to calculate kind of all their assets and liabilities and that kind of thing. And so I don't think. Yeah.
So I mean, if I understood correctly, like from the money and banking lectures, like when we're talking about that equity, it is basically pretty much net worth, right? It's the difference between all your assets and all your liabilities, roughly.
Yeah.
So
and
if
then
the
the question is how useful of a number is that?
Sorry again.
I said the question is how useful of a number is that?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, if the government is spending by going into debt, then surely, well, if their debt increases, then they do go into negative equity, and it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah. If you're netting out all the assets and liabilities, yeah. But a big thing that we try not to do in the money view is net everything out. Like it's okay for everyone to be a gross creditor and a gross debtor. And it's okay if those numbers don't match up. And how do you even calculate those numbers? Is it discounted present value of future cash flows? Is it the market value of what that asset would be if you sold it on the market today? Is it the face value, or is it the book value, the price you bought it at, right? There's a lot of different ways to do the accounting. And none of them are wrong, but they'll give you a different answer.
And if you did net everything out, then you couldn't see when somebody was expanding their balance sheet on both sides, right?
Yeah, if someone expands their balance sheet on both sides, that looks like a zero, nothing operation if you're netting everything out. Yeah.
Can you just expand a little bit on the idea of, you mentioned at the start, like ideally we'd like to be closer to a world where UBI is 100% of GDP. I don't think many people are thinking like that. I think people probably are assuming that, ideally, they grant that GDP can be portioned off to other things, but ideally they're thinking about a world where people want to be like, all the money that's being spent is going towards useful work, but then maybe we portion off some of it for consumption, right? So like, I don't know, what would you respond if someone says that's crazy? Why would you want to live in a world like that? How do you respond
Yeah,
to
so I
that?
have a Medium article entitled "The Economy as a Giant Vending Machine," right? And it's basically starts with this thought experiment where there's one machine that's producing stuff for everybody. There's no labor. Everybody gets these kind of tokens, these ration of tokens that they can go put money into the vending machine and get goods and services out, right? And that's the UBI, right? So in this thought experiment, the UBI pays for all the production. The production is when the stuff comes out of the machine, and the UBI are the tokens that you go in. That's the money that you put into the machine to claim the goods and services from it, right? So that's kind of a world where we don't need any labor anymore, right? And that's kind of never going to happen in real life, but we do get closer to that with, as we develop more and more labor-saving technology. So if you see, a model where the UBI is a very high percentage of GDP, that isn't automatically a bad thing. And you could even see a model where the UBI is higher than 100% of today's GDP, because once you've implemented the UBI, the GDP will be higher than that even. You could also imagine, I don't know, if people are accumulating money and not spending it on output or something like that, that the UBI could be higher than 100% of GDP.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And then the only thing you have to do to get from that analogy to our world is just sort of grant that, like, well, to an extent, people, right, and our behavior, our social systems, that's a part of the machine. And then the question
Yeah.
is, what balance do you want? Do you want the machine using up as much of our time as possible, or do you want the machine benefiting us as much as possible? Then you just compute the flows of money that you expect from that outcome.
Well, right. I mean, it's in our world, we need some labor. So how much of the GDP do we carve out for wages, right? So you have to reduce the UBI by that amount, essentially, in order to provide sufficient incentive for people to work.
So consumers are going to have a certain amount of spending power. Some of that's going to come from unconditional sources. Some of it will come from wages, which are conditional and motivate them to work. And this is about how we enable a transition from a world where, a small amount of stuff is made by large numbers of desperate workers toward a world where a much greater amount of stuff is made by a small number of really productive and high tech and ambitious workers.
Yeah, or you could just say another way of framing that is saying that our stuff is made more by capital and machines and technology, with some a small number of workers operating that machinery.
And of course, you can't have something like that, right? You can't. It could be that we already have the technology to make the same amount of stuff with far smaller percentages of the population working than we currently have, right? But we couldn't do that because then everybody would be poor. So
yeah,
we want to discover how much of the current employment rate is actually just for the sake of getting the money to people, right, as opposed to making the stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I don't think, especially for the first part of this discussion on Saturday, I don't think any of the people there were thinking about UBI in this way. They're thinking about kind of macroeconomy that's described by Keynes, post-Keynesians, and you've got it works a certain way, and then there's certain kind of social benefits that you want to kind of pay for, and does it make sense for UBI or guaranteed income to be one of them to kind of prevent people from kind of starving or being homeless or that kind of thing.
As a government, you have some small amount of surplus that you get through taxes, and this is your discretionary budget, and you can afford to do a little bit of welfare to protect people who have lost their jobs or something. But they're really not thinking of it as like a sort of something that can be a big and a long-term thing.
Yeah, and it's even true, right? If you want to solve the problem of how to support people in today's economy who, for whatever reason, don't have jobs, then you're going to want to target the people who don't have jobs. And if you want to do it through cash assistance, then it's going to look like something like a guaranteed income, not like a UBI, right? But if you're imagining that the way we get everybody their money is broken, not just the poor people, and that rich people are part of the reason they're rich is because of this thing that's broken too. It's like you have to imagine that everybody kind of starts equal, and you give the same amount of money to everyone, and then you can see, like, I don't know how some people get richer than others and that kind of thing, but like you can't go in by assuming that, oh, the rich people that are rich today are going to be the same ones who are rich in a UBI world or something like that. I mean, it kind of will to some extent, right? Because you're starting with a bunch of assets or something like that, and it's this world turning into that world, right? It's a transition, but it's not like just because you have a job in today's world, you have a job in a UBI world. No. I mean, Elon Musk will still be probably very rich, maybe not as rich in a UBI world, but he's still probably richer than the average person, or much richer than the average person, right?
I mean, you can get rich by, I mean, the whole reason why capitalism, if we're going to call it that, works as well as it does is that you can get rich by making something viable for a large number of people, right?
Yeah, and I think
in UBI world, right? In fact, it'd be more true because you can make money by giving stuff selling stuff to people who are currently homeless and don't have any money, right? Because they'll have.
Right, and I think that the point that I'm making is that you can't just ex ante say, oh, these are the rich people and these are the poor people, and this is how rich everyone is, and this is how poor everyone is, and that's a fixed thing, right? And then how do we kind of help support the people who are poor, right? Like, that's not a fixed thing. That's a product of the way our economy works now. And if we change the way our economy works, that's going to change, who has a job, who doesn't, who's rich, who's poor, that kind of thing. You can't just assume that, there's a certain amount of poor people and we want to try to support those people. Because then you're just assuming that the economy is what it is, and you're just kind of tacking something onto it as a Band-Aid. Whereas UBI, like, guaranteed income is more of a Band-Aid, right? It's a Band-Aid on the fact that people get left behind by the economy the way it works now. Whereas UBI changes the underlying problem. It addresses the underlying problem.
Yeah, there's very much a perception that poverty is just sort of like a fact of life, like tuberculosis used to be, right? And you're just going to have to, you can do various things to sort of like deal with it and mitigate it and make it bearable, and that's worth doing, and that's what we spend our time trying to figure out how to do. Not a lot of people imagine that you could actually solve poverty, right? And, in a UBI world, I mean, I can't imagine that you would really have such a thing as like the poor as they currently exist in a country with a UBI, right? I mean, unless the whole country's economy was like, really so weak that they simply could not make enough stuff, and there certainly are countries like that. You would have an actual minimum income, right? The distribution of incomes would look completely different. It wouldn't start at zero and then peak somewhere and then go off. It would just start over here and then just go down. And you would have nobody below that threshold, whatever it is.
You'd always have a poorest person in the world, but the poorest person in the world doesn't have to be poor. Yeah. Basically.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty much. Oh, yeah. The other thing I wanted to get to was there's this question of deflation that Eddie brought up in the chat the other day. Is deflation okay? And I think he was kind of combining two different things in that question, right? He was asking, what if you don't print any money? What if you don't add any new money to the economy? Is that okay? Well, that's not the same thing as saying is deflation okay, right? Because regardless if you have deflation or inflation, the economy needs a source of money so people can buy stuff. So if you stop adding money to the economy, there's going to be some kind of catastrophic collapse, right?
I mean, it depends the extent to which the money circulates, right? Like, if people's sort of perception that the money is like oil in an engine rather than fuel, and it just goes round and round, and the same dollar will be spent by many, many people forever, and it never just, ends up sitting in a big pile somewhere and staying there, then maybe you wouldn't need a source of money, right? You could just let it keep on circulating.
Yeah, and I guess anytime you're issuing new money, you can maybe tell a story about how the money that is flowing out is the same money that's flowing back in. So maybe it's a matter of framing a little bit about whether money is circulating or whether it's flowing from a source to a destination. You know what I mean? If the flow of the money in the economy is fixed, a fixed size, you can always tell that story. You can always make up some kind of explanation for how the money that's flowing out is the same money that's flowing in, right? And you're actually not adding money to the economy. It's the same money or something like that. And I think if you do that, then then you have kind of the world that Eddie's imagining, where there's a fixed amount of money out there. You're not adding any. It's just the same amount of money flowing and flowing and flowing. And then if your economy grows and the amount of money being spent kind of stays fixed, then you have deflation, right? But that's very different from kind of the deflationary collapse that would happen if you shut off the flow of money, right? So I wanted to kind of separate those two things. And then once you're talking about this kind of deflation that's just as a result of kind of productivity growth, because you're keeping the flow of money fixed, you're keeping the money supply fixed, then there's a question of, is that so bad? Is that such a bad thing? And I think that's where kind of Derek's point about, well, then you've got maybe a problem with monetary stability, right? People are not able to kind of price things in terms of money as efficiently, because the purchasing power of money keeps changing, that kind of thing. And deflation makes it harder to pay back nominal debts. And, like, how can you even implement like negative nominal interest rates? That's a really hard thing to do. So there are some problems with deflation, even if you're not talking about this kind of deflationary collapse, money flow drying up scenario. And there are problems with deflation that are analogous to the problems that you have with inflation, but there are problems you have with deflation that are not there with inflation, right? Like if you have inflation, you can always have positive interest rates. You can always, you can, let's put it another way. You're never going to lend someone money and ask them to pay you back less in the future, right? So that's a negative interest rate. And to make things work in a deflationary world, to make the debts repayable, sometimes that's what you have to do. So you're just not going to lend. You're going to hold on the money as an asset, right? In an inflationary world, you can charge an interest rate, or yeah.
Can you help me understand that a little better? You're saying that in a deflationary world, because usually when I emphasize the differences between the unique problems associated with deflation that aren't associated with inflation, I think my mind goes automatically somewhere else. It goes to maybe like creating this artificial incentive to save, but I guess that's similar to the problem with inflation, just the opposite end. Are you saying in a world of deflation, in order to make that work in terms of monetary policy, interest rates have to be negative at times? Why is that?
I'm saying that let's say the interest rate at which you borrow would be 3% ordinarily, but you've got like negative 6% inflation. You've got 6% deflation. So now a 3% real interest rate would be a negative 3% interest rate. But I'm not going to lend you that money because I can just hold on to that money and get a positive 3% real interest rate.
I see. Okay, that's interesting.
So to make the same loans work, you have to do something that nobody's going to do. Yeah. And that's related to people just holding onto their money and not lending it, right? Or not spending it. It's interesting though, because there's also, I think by default, people in this room think that if it's inflation, people want to spend their money more, so they spend it before it loses its value. And if it's deflation, they kind of want to hold on to it because it's going to gain value. But that's not always what happens either. It can also be that deflation is increasing the amount of real money that you have to spend. So you're richer. So maybe you spend more money, right? At least in real terms. And inflation means that you have less money to spend. So you have to tighten your belt and save and be more careful. And I think we saw some of that in the recent inflation. Obviously, if it's a hyperinflation, you're just trying to get rid of your cash and turn it into something else. But if you're still kind of using money as money and it hasn't like tipped over into this hyperinflationary type scenario, then sometimes inflation is going to cause people to spend less in real terms because they have less real purchasing power with the same money.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's not how I normally think about it. We'll have to talk more about that. That's interesting.
Yeah. But this is why I like to, in my thinking, I always try to imagine a world with zero inflation. And then I imagine like what policy would have to do to kind of achieve that. And I can say like, oh, well, if you don't hit that target, then things get complicated. And that's really the real disadvantage to either inflation or deflation, is that things get complicated. Not just for the theorists, but for ordinary people trying to navigate the world.
Yeah, everything's a lot simpler if you just don't have to, if you just know a priori that there's no inflation or deflation,
Yeah.
and real and nominal prices are the same thing.
Yeah. And maybe 2% is small enough that it's fine for ordinary people, and as long as you're hitting that target and it's not moving around too much, then maybe that's fine too.
Yeah, it's a time frame thing, right? Like, I mean, there is a lot of inflation, even if it's just at 2%, when you're looking over a long time frame, like a couple of decades or something, right? It's just that we're not generally operating at those time frames most of the time, so it's tolerable. And if inflation is much higher, then that time frame contracts and it becomes a problem at shorter and shorter timescales, right?
Given all this confusion that lack of price stability causes, I mean, you'd think that I understand the idea that there might be reasons to sort of let it fluctuate or you go, but we try to stay agnostic about what the target should be, right? I understand that. Like it could be 2%, 3%, 0%. Basic income can get you there either way. The question I have is like, what's your best argument for picking something other than zero, like picking something like a 2% or something in UBI world, right? Like what's the main advantage that picking a low and stable positive rate of inflation offers you? Because I was under the assumption that today one of the major reasons is that it's harder to control deflation with monetary policy. But with UBI, you're not as worried about it, right? Because you can always just give people more money to spend. So what's the big reason to choose a positive low rate of inflation in world of UBI?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always going to be true that you're never going to be perfect on your target. So if you have a little bit of a positive target, then you're not going to accidentally tip over into deflation or something like that. I think that's the main reason.
That's the main. So deflation is still worse than inflation. A little bit of deflation is still worse than a little bit of inflation, even
Deflation
in the
is
UBI world.
Yeah, deflation is still worse. It's not You're not going to have this deflationary collapse that I was just talking about in a UBI world, because the deflation will cause the purchasing power of the UBI to go up and up and up, and eventually, people, the price level have to stop going down because people have the same nominal amount of money that they're able to spend all the time. It's not like a world where everyone gets their money from wages, and the deflation causes people to lose their jobs, which causes a spiral where now they have less money and less wages, and then more businesses fail and more people lose their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't have that problem. I don't think deflation would be the end of the world in a UBI world. My intuition is that inflation is a little bit safer, and that includes, like, if there's a big supply shock or something and the economy can't produce as much. I think it's kind of maybe more safe to let the inflation kind of do a lot of the adjustment rather than like lowering the UBI.
Yeah, it sort of happens automatically, right?
But if you have a shock in the other direction, like suddenly we're allowed to produce a lot more stuff, my intuition, as we're able to produce a lot more stuff, my intuition is that you just want to increase the UBI. You don't want to allow
absorb some of that, right? Maybe you don't have to perfectly control the price level, but if it was a lot, then you'd raise the UBI, right, and not have a lot of deflation.
Yeah.
I remember I asked you once, like, what would happen if you just you calibrated basic income and then fixed it there, and then the economy continued to grow, right? And you have like more and more businesses getting better and better tech, and they're trying to make more and more stuff and compete to sell things to competing for the same fixed flow of money all the time. And I guess because they're competing, they're going to end up making more and more stuff, and you said you would get deflation over time.
Yeah, I mean, you'd also have to say, like, oh, central bank, you're not allowed to boost demand either, right? What would happen in our world is that the central bank would say, oh no, it looks like we're seeing some deflationary pressures, we're going to lower interest rates, and then you start getting the financial sector instability again.
Yeah.
But if you say central bank, interest rates are going to stay where they are, UBI is going to stay where it is, then yeah, you just have this kind of steady deflation, I suppose.
It just occurred to me, I wonder if a lot of the because obviously inflation's like such a hot topic. It's always what people are talking about in the news, and people are wondering, should we blame the president for it or something? Like it occurred to me that in our world, right, where you get your money from your job, and we've talked about how that might actually kind of make economic, well, not economic, but geographic mobility a little bit harder, right? Because you're sort of constrained to being where your job is. In a world where you can kind of have more economic freedom to kind of go where you please, maybe the difference between inflation and local price rises become more clear, right? Because in our world, let's say you live in a seaside city, and real estate prices start going up across the city. That might start you get you complaining about the Fed, or complaining about inflation, because it seems, as far as you're concerned, that like prices are, and as far as you're concerned, they are going up everywhere, right? Like all the prices are going up, but you're not really paying attention to the fact that just across the board, the city lines, there's another rural town where prices are not, that's not happening. So it's interesting. I can imagine a world where people, when they're more free to move, it might become more obvious, like when inflation is a problem, when it isn't. I'm concerned that a lot of these days people miss the positive effects of changing price signals for the economy, and they just sort of lump that all in with this macroeconomic issue of price stability being out of whack. And I wonder if that's a contributing factor, the fact that people are made to live in these particular areas.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, because the UBI would cause prices to go down in some places and go up in other places, right? And then what are the effects of kind of the local or regional deflation or inflation? Is that I'm here saying that deflation is worse than inflation, but you're really going to have both, depending on where your location is in a UBI world. So that's something I'd have to think about.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean our definition of inflation, right? If it's happening locally, then that just means a town is getting more desirable to live in, and maybe the supply, the availability of that whole piece of the economy is now there's not as much supply of that, right? So the price is going up, which is different from if the currency's value is changing.
Well, the currency's value is changing in that particular location.
So you have like inflation or deflation in a particular state or something, but not at the level of like the United States or something when you average it all out.
Yeah. Are you suggesting, is there some way in which, when you're managing UBI for price stability, that you don't only want to look at the price indexes of the whole economy, you'd want to also try to make it sure that, like, state to state, or
No, I think you'd want to do it.
Yeah, it can be a good thing if if prices are trying to go up in one place and go down in another. Maybe there's a reason for that, and you shouldn't try to sort of suppress that, and you should let people respond to it by moving around and buying stuff where it's cheaper, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's generally a good thing for the prices to adjust and even out regionally across regions.
I bring it up because I find people don't like that. They want to think that either prices stay the same or go down, right? And they don't want to think about a price rising anywhere as potentially being a good thing for the economy.
Yeah, it's like you said though, like people are much more mobile in UBI world. It is I can't imagine they necessarily like having to move house or anything, but they would have the opportunity to do so much more easily, right? Because they're not tied down by their jobs as much. It's not such a difficult thing to. I mean, Andrew Yang talked about this during his campaign as well. Actually, job lock's real, and it's a major risk to pack your bags and move across the country. And the main part of that is that you got to make sure you secure a new source of income that has to be enough to fund your whole existence in this new place that you're going to, where everything is unknown and scary. And that's much less the case in a basic income world.
Yeah, I think some of this is just going to have to be like people getting used to things working differently, because whenever people imagine specific consequences of UBI, they're imagining it in the context of today's society and today's economy and that kind of thing. But it's going to change, and I think society will adapt and culture will adapt and people's psychology around these things will adapt as the world changes.
Yeah, that's why we do it slowly.
Maybe in the future, when we all have more incomes, people will start to think about price changes as less unfriendly, things that drive people into poverty, and it'll be more like traffic lights. Like if a price is going up, that's like a red light. It means, hey, you better slow down, you better stop consuming these particular resources. It's a discouragement it conserves those resources a little bit. Whereas a green light and price is going down, it's like, okay, this is more available. There's signals from the economy to us that tell us kind of to encourage or discourage us from using particular things in particular times and places. And that's better than just us continuing to consume those things and then them running out entirely and then no one can get them.
Yeah. All right. Well, there was one more thing I wanted to talk about, and I opened up my text editor to write it down so I wouldn't forget. But by the time I opened it up, I had already forgotten. So.
Oh, well,
maybe
save
I'll
it for next
remember
time.
for next time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I've got to go too. So, yeah.
All right. I'll meet you guys back in the other lounge. Thanks.
Yep.
Okay. Then he had another question about Rousseau, and this is something anybody who writes a book like this has to face, is the noble savage allegation. Oh, you said something nice about native peoples. Oh, you must be romanticizing them like the noble savage. Well, actually, the term noble savage was created in the 1850s by a group of proto-anthropologists that thought that their burgeoning field of anthropology wasn't